Welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Dr. Shalai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I am a lecturer in early childhood studies at Bath Spa University, an associate lecturer at the Open University, a trustee for the Fatherhood Institute, and an independent writer, speaker, and consultant for critical early years. Now, throughout this series, we'll be exploring representation in the early years, inspiring you with guidance on ways to be more inclusive in your practice through covering topics such as cultural and gender diversity. And on that note, I'm delighted to introduce Gina Rippon as today's guest. Okay, so I'm interested in talking about the current context of gender in children's play. Why should we be keeping gender on the agenda, especially at such an early age?
I think the key thing is that everything that children do in the early years is almost like a training opportunity. And play in particular is the ultimate training opportunity. And I think sometimes people forget that. They think, oh, well, let's give them a toy to give me a break or so I can get on with the supper or something like that. But actually, I think if people think quite carefully about what a child is learning when they're playing, the toys they're playing with, but also how they play together. And that both of those aspects are really affected by gender. And there is some very interesting work because brain imaging obviously started with adults, but we now able to look at intact living human brains and in little intact living humans. So we can actually watch what's happening in quite small children's brains while they're playing. And a very early observation was about spatial construction toys and demonstrating that children who were playing with Lego or building things or manipulating shapes in a particular way, you could demonstrate that actually activated the emerging spatial processing areas, if you like, in the brain. So it was actually, and I believe this, sort of shaping the brain, because brains are very plastic, and the most plastic time of brain development is in the early years. So everything that happens in the early years is also going to change the brain. And I think that's something people forget because they assume that, you arrive in the world with this brain, which gets bigger, but actually it's a kind of one directional. They don't realize how much what's going on in the outside world will change that brain development. So the spatial toys is very interesting. So the children who get exposed to spatial toys get better at spatial tasks. And one of the other things about the human brain is that, if it finds something easier, it will encourage its owner to carry on doing those kind of tasks and they will get more enjoyment out of them, etc. So you can see that kind of training opportunity. But more recently, there's been some interesting work done looking at children playing with dolls' houses or kitchens as a group and demonstrating that the kind of script or narrative that emerges round a group of children sharing a common interest activates the more social parts of the brain. So again, what you're learning in the early years is the way in which your play can affect your social skills, allow you to belong to a group, makes you feel good about it too. So you then think that what's happening is that children are learning to play together. So they're not just getting individual training opportunities, they are also learning to play with other children.
Yeah, lots of really important insights there, I guess, on peer socialization and the importance of play in those early years. We often talk about the first 1,000 days as being really crucial in terms of how children come to develop their own identity and their own sense of self. But what are those factors at play in terms of whether or not a child will conform to the sex assigned to them at birth, or that might enable them to challenge those factors? How do children come to learn about these sorts of ideas?
Yes, generally speaking, parents might not experience this. Children are really quite conformist. And certainly in the early years, we talk about children as being sort of ferocious gender detectives, but they're also gender police. So they have this, the message they're getting is that, girls dress up like this and boys do this. And of course, in a way, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy because, a child goes to nursery and it's the girls who are around the sing up books and maybe the boys who are out in the playing area racing around and things like that. So they pick up fairly clearly, their gender radar attuned. I'm a girl, this is what girls do. I'm a boy, this is what boys do. And they're quite fierce about that in the early years, as nursery parents and nursery teachers will probably attest. And so there are messages out there. And of course, certainly in the 21st century, I think the sort of gender bombardment that is in the outside world via social media, video games, the images, books, clothes in particular. I mean, the Let Toys Be Toys movement, I think, is the grassroots movement, which say, can we please stop gendering toys? Really important, because children pick up on these things. And you can demonstrate that. You can show that if you give a child a neutral object like a melon baller or something and paint it either pink or blue and say, who do you think would play with this? Very young children, 3-4-year-olds, will sort it neatly into, these are for the girls and these are for the boys. So they pick up that message very early on.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like what you're saying now about children being gender detectives, but also gender police. I guess to an extent it is that kind of self-fulfilling prophecy that you talk about. I'm interested in the role of practitioners and staff working with young children and what role they can play in supporting or challenging gender stereotypes and differences in young children's play.
Well, certainly being aware of what's going on. I guess if you've got a room full of noisy toddlers, actually saying, well, at least we'll put the boys outside and the girls can, play in the toy kitchen or something like that. That's the kind of thing they've got to be really careful about. And the nursery itself, if we're talking nurseries, can establish that by removing as much of those opportunities as possible. So all the girls and boys together go out and play in the mud or something, and all the boys and girls together come in and play with the toy kitchen. So I think just keeping an eye out for that, but also being aware of individual differences, which is, as I say, all very well for somebody outside not having to deal with it for 12 hours or whatever it is they do every day, because there will be some feisty little girls and some gentle little boys. And so sometimes practitioners need to be aware of their own biases and think, I shouldn't expect that little boy would enjoy playing football and make him go out, man up sort of thing. And similarly with the girls. So it's almost the impossible task of saying, be really aware of gender by removing gender completely from the equation. And of course, you get the classic thing about, I mustn't think that all girls want to do this and all boys want to do that. But so it's a balancing act. But I think being aware of their own biases is probably the most important starting point.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you say there about critical reflection on the behalf of the practitioner and really reflecting on perhaps their own identity and the beliefs that they might have about gender can really affect how they then go on to view the child. But there is that paradox you speak about there. We need to make it more visible. We need to be aware of it more in order to make it matter less. And that's often the case with a lot of things when we talk about inclusion. Right. So it's really, really important that we have an understanding of that. I know that you were involved in a fantastic documentary on No More Boys and Girls, Can Our Kids Go Gender Free? I wonder if you just mind sharing your insights on that and what you learned from being part of that documentary.
Yes, that was very interesting. It's 4 years ago now, I think. And it was a 2-part documentary where a film crew, BBC film crew, went into a class of 6-7-year-olds for 6 weeks. And they identified and removed anything from the classroom and the teacher's behaviour and the children's behaviour and the kind of surroundings which flagged gender. So there was the children's coat cupboards. So there was a coat cupboard with a blue door for the boys' coats and a coat cupboard with a pink door for the girls' coats. And nobody, really knew why there was and where it had come from. And so they involved the children. They painted the doors, both doors and things like that. So all the things, boys and girls lining up differently. The teacher called the girls Sweet Pea and the boys Mate. And so they then had a game where whenever he said that by mistake, the children could tell him off and give him a naughty point or something. So they kind of involved everybody in this, in a way, just as you said, making it matter more in order to make it matter less. So the children were also part of this. Gosh, it doesn't matter, if I'm a boy or a girl, I could do this. But what was interesting from my point of view, getting involved in it, was at the beginning, they actually took a measure with these children saying, what's it like to be a boy and what's it like to be a girl? So these were 6-year-olds, okay. And the girls are saying, well, boys are cleverer and they could grow up to be president. And the girls were, much more timid. They were asked to rate how well they do on various games. And the girls were down in I'd probably get a 3, but maybe a 4. Whereas the boys were, 10, 11, if I could, whatever. So at 6 years old, right at the beginning, you already saw that these children had absorbed what messages, but because, of course, they'd been listening to them for several years. And I thought that was interesting. And what was interesting was the change in the children over the 6 weeks. And that was really it. So the second episode was looking, towards the end of the 6 weeks. But they also went to their homes. One little girl who was sort of very shy had a whole wardrobe dedicated to her pink princess dresses and everything. So they actually got the parents to change to do the same. So she had to go and hide the pink dresses and things. And the parents hadn't really thought about it either. So it was a really interesting consciousness raising. The one thing they missed was that there was, I think, 3 or 4 classes of that age, and they took measures in the class at the beginning. They didn't follow up one of the other classes where they hadn't had the kind of gender intervention or gender freeing intervention, which of course would have been really interesting, because you could have said, we actually made quite a difference in that 6 weeks. And it was quite a free, it wasn't an expensive intervention. They didn't have to kind of completely change the infrastructure or the curriculum, they just made sure that people realized that everybody could do everything in this room, and anything which flagged up that boys and girls were different, they got rid of that. The title was perhaps a bit unfortunate, No More Boys and Girls, but anyway.
Yeah. No, it's a really fantastic documentary that I'd encourage listeners to read, to listen, to watch back and have a review over, and really reflect on their own practice where they can. Even though it was only kind of took place over a 6-week period, there was lots of important insights. It really shows what a difference you can make when you are proactive with these sorts of issues. But what happens when we get it wrong, Gina? What happens for settings that aren't being proactive with regards to challenging those gender stereotypes? I'm thinking particularly about boys, and perhaps there's long-term implications in terms of their mental health.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and I kind of, put my hands up to feel a bit guilty. There's a big focus on the fact that, we're saying women have been treated as inferior. We're still looking at gender gaps, but there are other sorts of gender gaps. And one of the things when I talk to parents, for example, would be to say because quite often there's an idea, and among practitioners as well, saying, well, this is the status quo. It's been like this, for generations. Why do we want to change it? And you can say, well, if you look at the underrepresentation of girls in science, for example, this is a big shame. But then if you look at the mental health statistics for young men, that the highest suicide rate is among young men, late teens, early 20s. And you say, well, whatever route these young people have been set on does not serve all of them well. So if we were living in a world where I don't know, I suppose it'd be a sort of Stepford Wives type world where all the females are completely happy with their roles, achieving their full potential, earning, same amount of money. And similarly with the males, you'd think, okay, well, maybe we've got it right, let's leave it alone. But we clearly haven't. So I think with the boys, the expression of emotions is probably the key aspect there. And there is this, classic, boys don't cry, man up type messages, which parents will acknowledge, teachers will acknowledge, nursery practitioners will acknowledge, because often it's a bit unconscious, and it has been around for a long time. So it's quite hard to say, if a little boy is upset, then let him cry, let him be upset. And they need as much comfort and consolation as girls.
It's really important that we have a focus on boys and girls and the ways in which those implications of gender play out differently and have those long-term implications in later life. I just want to focus a little bit more on the role of media and literacy in children's books. We mentioned Let Toys Be Toys earlier and the fantastic work that they've been doing in terms of representation. But what role does kind of children's literacy and the sorts of media that they engage with have in challenging these gender stereotypes that we're seeing in early childhood?
Very powerful role, again, because books and toys are the means by which children pick up differences, gender differences. So you also have the sort of let books be books as well, and say who's the hero in the book, who's the person who needs rescuing, and who's the person who does the rescuing. And that's moved on quite a lot. I think that there's some really lovely books out there, Letterbox Library, etc., where people are really drawing attention to the fact that there's been this sort of lifelong sustaining of stereotypes that it's the boy, the male, who's the knight who rides to the rescue, and the girl is the princess tied to the rock or whatever. So challenging those, and I think people are aware of the power that books have. So there's all sorts of interesting developments in terms of children with disabilities or children with unusual family structures, because children want to see people like them who live lives like them in the books they're being encouraged to read. And so I think that's really powerful, because again, we've got these very plastic brains, and our brains, we now know our brains are kind of rule generating systems. So they're constantly monitoring the outside world, on behalf of their owners, to say, what are people like you? What's expected of people like you? What does somebody like you encounter this kind of situation? How does the world expect you to deal with it? And the brain is kind of self-organizing system. So the brain will be training itself to say to this little girl, little boy, actually, people like you don't do that, or people like you do that. So it's a very powerful drive. And the most powerful drive of all that we have is the drive to belong. So if, there's a very powerful message that you as a little girl or a little boy need to belong to this group and not that group, and this is what this group does and this group doesn't do that. All of that is being established, and it's via the media. Games is another area. It's an area where Super Mario apparently is an amazing spatial training opportunity, and mostly it's boys who play Super Mario. So there's all sorts of things we need to realise what we're doing, because we're dealing with a very wonderfully plastic but surprisingly conformist organ.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you've said there summarises this episode so far. We've really underlined the importance of addressing gender in the early years through their play, looking at the ways in which they can be detectives, but also police when it comes to those gender stereotypes that we see. Really important that we understand the importance of critical reflection as well. So a key takeaway for this episode would really be to encourage practitioners to reflect on their own practice and enable children to challenge those stereotypes that they're learning from all different types of media within society. Thank you, Gina. would like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Gina Rippon, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Shaddai Tembo, and Gina Rippon. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and accessing exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.